Um, Thank you for being here for this wonderful occasion. I am very happy to welcome Professor Laura Engelstein, who is Henry McNeil Professor Emerita of Russian History at Yale University. Professor Engelstein joined the history faculty of Yale in the fall of 2002. She specializes in the field of modern Russian and European history. Professor Engelstein received her PhD from Stanford in 1976 and then taught at Cornell and at Princeton before coming to Yale. Her research has focused on the social and cultural history of late imperial Russia, with special attention to the role of law, medicine, and the arts in public life. Professor Engelstein has also explored themes in the history of gender, sexuality, and religion. Among Professor Engelstein's publications are Russia in Flames, War, Revolution, and Civil War, 1914-1921. Just a parenthesis, it's a wonderful book and probably one of the best syntheses of the period in historiography, to put it in context. So I highly recommend it to all of you. This work has been published in 2018 with Oxford University Press. Professor Engelstein has also translated, together with Grażyna Drabik, Andrei Bobkovsky. Among the other publications, I could mention Wartime Notebooks, France 1940-1944, Moscow 1905, Working Class Organization and Political Conflict, published back in 1982. The Keys to Happiness, Sex and the Search for Modernity in Fin de Siècle Russia, published in 1992. Another fundamental book, I would say, Castration and the Heavenly Kingdom, a Russian folktale, from 1999. Also Slavophile Empire, Imperial Russia's Illiberal Path, 2009, which sounds quite timely, especially the liberal framework, I would say. And last but not least, Professor Engelstein has also edited, together with Stephanie Sandler, an essay collection titled Self and Story in Russian History in 2000. Professor Engelstein has received awards from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the National Humanities Center, and the Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a corresponding fellow of the British Academy. Sorry if I took up maybe too much of the time, but I hope you will appreciate our guest today even more. So without further ado, Professor Engelstein will talk to us about displacements, large and small, focusing on how Maurice Greenfield from Copanca survived war and revolution. Professor Engelstein, you have the floor.
So thank you so much for the introduction, and okay, it's supposed to be closer to me. Okay, so I have to do several things at once. Is this right? Does this sound good? Okay. So I want to thank Andrei for the introduction, and especially Igor Cașu for inviting me to come to Chișinău. And when he invited me for professional scholarly reasons, I said, and yes, by the way, my family comes from here. So this is a wonderful occasion to go to the point of origin of my mother's family. And you will hear more about that today. That's the subject of my talk today. I will introduce you to one of the members of my family. I also want to thank Irina Nikoric and Irina Shishkova for taking us on a tour of Jewish sites in Chișinău yesterday, which was a wonderful way to be introduced to the city. So today my subject is my grandfather, who was born in Copanca near Bender in 1886. In his homeland, he was called Moise Greenfield. In America, he became Morris Greenfield. So I want to begin with this image. This is The Traveler. It is a painting by Marc Chagall. Marc Chagall, the Jewish, I would hyphenate him these days, probably Belarusian. He was born in Vitebsk. He died in Paris, so he was a wandering fellow himself, and he painted this painting. Now, most of his paintings, if you're familiar with him, have people flying over the shtetl. So they are escaping in their dreams. But this guy, he's not escaping in his dreams. He's walking. And he's walking not over a shtetl, as far as I could see, but a modern urban landscape. He's dressed, I would say, as a fancy guy in yellow pants, and he's going somewhere. This could be my grandfather. He's born in a little town. He's the same age as Chagall. He's born in 1886, 1 year earlier. And he dies not in Paris, like Chagall, but in Brooklyn in 1961 at the age of 75. So now I have to find the key. Oops. Wait a second. I already forgot. Where's the key? Oh, ahead? Yeah, here we go. So this is Moishe, and I have compared here two different things. Here's the chronology of his life. I hope everyone here is a Russian reading, correct? More or less? So this, I'm speaking in English. Russian is kind of subtitles for people who like to think in two languages, and I'll be commenting. So this is the chronology of his life. He's born, he's, and on the other side is a typology of types of movement, population movement. And that subject, the theme of the talk is motion, movement, population displacement. A sub-theme of the talk is anti-Semitism. But these are the, in conceptual terms, the forms of displacement that are exemplified, demonstrated in the life of my grandfather. So we have the draft, which is compulsory. Desertion, which is voluntary. Emigration, voluntary. Flight is voluntary, but often pushed by some emergency or some situation. And then subjekstvo, перемещение на месте. So displacement in place. You don't go anywhere, but the place changes. So my grandfather is born in Copanca, in Bessarabia under Russian rule. And when he runs away from what was going to be Soviet Russia, back to his hometown, which is still Copanca, it's Romania. So that is what I call перемещение на месте. And then выгнание, which is you're pushed out, you're expelled, and this is obviously not voluntary. So these are the, and that's the one form of all these forms of displacement that my particular grandfather did not experience. So the first thing I want to say about my grandfather is, where did he fit on the social ladder? So I Googled around for Greenfield or Greenfield, and I found a famous Greenfield from Bessarabia, which is Nadezhda Evgenieva Greenfield. So it's obviously a Russian version of her name. And she was not her own name, it was her married name. Her husband was Greenfield, he was a lawyer, her father was a lawyer, and they were Bundists, they were political activists, they were Russian speaking. They were part of the Jewish Bessarabian elite. And obviously, if you Google, you can find them. You're not going to find my grandfather by Googling. He's the kind of person you never heard of. He was an ordinary guy. He was not interested in politics at all, but he had cultural aspirations and, importantly for our story, he thought his life was interesting enough to write a memoir about it, presumably for his grandchildren or something. So this is his memoir, handwritten in Yiddish, translated into English by my mother, who in her origins was called Frema in Yiddish, Fima in America. She is the child in the middle. On the right is Moishe Greenfield. On the left is my grandmother, Riva Greenfield May Rosenfeld. And this is by the time they get to Romania in 1923. And this manuscript is a very interesting manuscript. And I'm thinking, when I was already thinking before Igor invited me, that I might want to do something with this as a historical document, as a historical source. it's a very good story. He tells the story very well. So he starts out in the village of this. Also, I realize I'm coming to Moldavia to talk about Moldavian or Bessarabian history. So this is close to Newcastle. So much of this, the background that I would have to explain to other people, you people know. So this is the province of Bessarabia. This is the Pale of Settlement where the Jews were compelled to, most Jews were compelled to reside under the Tsarist regime. And these are images from the period of being there. So what happens to my grandfather, whose young life spans the time, including these enormous events of World War I, the Revolution, the Civil War. So he has a story to tell, and he gets involved in it. So he starts out in the Pale of Settlement, and these events propel him halfway across the world, literally. And that is the story of motion, of movement that he is going to tell us. So in Copanca, the Jews of the Pale of Settlement in general, more or less, were 10% more or less of the population. In all the cities of the Pale of Settlement, they constituted a much disproportionate percent of the population. And that was true even of a small town like Copanca. He remembers that there were 40 Jewish families. He remembers that most of them were really poor. And as he says, they ran around in, their shoes were worn down, their clothing were in rags. And his own family was economically on the edges. He was one of 10 surviving children. And I don't know, I have information to know it, maybe 15 or something, and it's suggested by some people who have done some informal research. And by the time he's 8 years old, in 1894, this is when Nicholas II, Tsar Nicholas II, comes to the throne. The family is in trouble, and two older brothers, and this is typical of such a family. They had both served in the military. One moved to Odessa. The other one in 1904 already emigrated to New York. Morris is back home. The father becomes ill. He has to stop taking his Hebrew lessons. All Jewish boys had Hebrew lessons. And he has to go to work. And the things he does, you'll recognize from this region. He works picking fruit, harvesting grapes. He labors in a local grapes. He works in a vineyard. So he does, sort of casual labor associated with the local agriculture. And he has romantic memories of the countryside, of the flowering trees, of the fruits that were the fruits and the produce that was produced in the region. But this kind of casual labor wasn't enough, and he decides he needs to get skills so he can really go into business and start earning serious money. And what he needs for business is the Russian language. The Russian language is the key. And I know I've read enough to know that many Jews of the region oriented toward the Russian language, especially those on that side of the river. But he couldn't go to school. The Jewish children were forbidden to go to the local Russian-speaking schools, were held in the churches. However, as he says, their local priest was not an anti-Semite. He was friendly to the Jews. And the teachers were afraid that the school inspector would show up and discover a Jewish kid, but nevertheless, they let him sit in. And this is the entire key to his survival of all these big historical events. On the question of anti-Semitism, he is aware of anti-Semitism as an obstacle to his personal ambitions and as an insult to his dignity. But he doesn't describe anti-Semitism in everyday life. He does not mention the two big examples of anti-Semitic violence in this region. He doesn't say one word about the 1903 pogrom, not one word about the 1905 pogrom in Odessa. It just doesn't register. Maybe it registered then, but in retrospect, when he's looking back in old age, that's not important to his story. This is not a story of victims. This is a story of a young guy who does the best he can. He rolls with the punches, as we say in Emerita, and he makes it. So it's not a sad story. It's a jaunty story, just like the guy in yellow trousers. So Copanca was this little town, but it gave him the tools with which to survive, to move out, to face the challenges that he encountered. And these skills are soon put to the test. As we may remember from the last slide, he is drafted in 1907. He's 21, and his regiment of Bessarabians is transported by train all the way to Vladivostok. This is an interesting map. It comes from the New York Public Library. It's a map that was published during World War I. You can tell because it says Petrograd on the map, St. Petersburg. And that's a tiny little map of the Trans-Siberian Railroad on which they were transported. So it took him 6 weeks from get to here to there. And when he gets to Vladivostok, he has a sympathetic commander, which means that, as he describes it, he's not an anti-Semite, and who decides to take him on as his he notices his beautiful handwriting in Russian. And this happens to many, actually, Jewish draftees. When they discovered that they were literate in Russian, they served as clerks in the army. Not all Jews were literate in Russian by far, but those who were often fulfilled this function. So he is engaged as a secretary, as a clerk, but he's really disgusted at the way Jews are treated in the army, and he makes a decision. He says, I decided to go to America. So in this respect, my grandfather actually fulfilled the stereotype that anti-Semites and bureaucrats had about Jews. It was a stereotype that, to some extent, coincided with reality, which is to say some Jewish men did choose immigration over the draft. They maybe did not go so far as to be drafted and desert, but that was something that was not uncommon. However, at the same time, Jews did serve in the Imperial Army in proportion to their share of the population. And I even checked a little local draftees from Vignères, those who perished in the war. There's a list you can find. Certainly they were like a quarter of the guys who died in the war, the Great War, were of Jewish, judging by their names. So the brother who's in New York says, you know, make a break, come join me. So he decides to go to America. What does he do? From Vladivostok, where he was stationed, he takes, here's a map, the Chinese Eastern Railroad. So he gets on in Vladivostok, you can see it. He takes the railroad to Harbin. Do you see Harbin on there? I don't have a pointer. So Vladivostok to Harbin, he's going west. Harbin is a Russian-sponsored city in China with a considerable already Jewish population. Actually, Jews were encouraged to settle there because it was a focus of economic development. So here is where the Jewish safety net comes into play. And there are two languages that serve him in his motion. Russian, he translates between Russian authorities, Jewish draftees. It enables him to get out of actually being on the battlefield for most of the war. But Yiddish is the lingua franca. Yiddish is the language that Jews, when they recognize each other and help each other out in the course of this journey. So he's bilingual in that respect. It's useful. So what happens? He gets to Harbin. He doesn't know anybody. He notices a cab driver who appeared to be Jewish, he writes. This guy takes him to a Jewish home, and it turns out the head of the house in Harbin knows a family friend of the Greenfields who lives in Vladivostok, and then they help this young man. He shows up at their doorstep. They give him some money. They help him make arrangements to get from Harbin to Dalny at the bottom there in Japanese-controlled sphere, and then on to Shanghai. And this is the beginning of a quite remarkable journey. And here is a map, and we're going to see that he goes all the way from Vladivostok, Harbin, around, let's see if I have this, to Shanghai. I don't have a pointer, so I can't, but you can find it for yourself. He's going to go all the way around. He's going to go around the bottom here, up through the Suez Canal, and all the way to Naples. So he boards a ship in Dalian, and he gets to Shanghai. And when he arrives, he's 22, he's clean shaven, he dresses well, he speaks well in Russian, and he finds a Jewish inn, a hotel, and the innkeeper employs him, because he knows Russian, to deal with suppliers and so on, as he waits for money to come from his brother in New York. And you're a student of immigration, so you have a family member who invites, a family member who sends money to enable this young guy, he's just a kid, right? He's running away to make it on this incredible journey. So when the money comes, he boards a German ship, and he travels this German ship all the way to Naples. In Naples, he boards an ocean liner. And he tells us this, the SS Königin Luisa. And he doesn't tell us when he leaves, but Dr. Google to the rescue again. You can actually find out that this particular ship docked in New York on April 2nd, 1909. He was on it, or he must have been on it. I haven't seen the ship manifest, but it coincides perfectly with the chronology. And in this respect, Morris is one of 2.5 million Jews who left Eastern Europe between 1905 and 1914. And about a third of them were headed, actually, for the United States. So I say, this is coming up next, immigration, there and back again. This is Naples to New York. This is New York, more or less in the period that he gets there. He's not living on Fifth Avenue, needless to say, but this evokes the time that he was there. His escape is, as you can see, temporary. It's very curious. In his memoir, he says he spent 3 years, 7 months, and 11 days in New York. So he was obviously counting. He's working for his brother in the garment industry, another characteristic Jewish occupation for immigrants in New York. He tries to establish a business of his own. He doesn't succeed. And then his father has died, and he decides to go back to his widowed mother. And if he had arrived in New York on April 12, 1909, he would have boarded ship on November 13, 1912, and arrived in Rotterdam on November 24th, 1912. And in fact, you can find that this ship, the SS Rotterdam, did arrive at that time, not on that date. And so he must have been on this one as well. So he travels now, interestingly enough. How do you get home? Here he is in Rotterdam. Rotterdam is not home. He takes a train to the border of Germany and Russian Poland. And I should point out, passports are not required. He didn't need a passport to get on or get off that ship. He didn't need a passport to go from here to there in Europe, but he's still afraid that the German guards at the train station are going to ask for papers, and so he decides to find a smuggler, someone to take him across the border. So you're asking, how do you get home? So who's he going to look for? Someone he can trust. He notices a Jew in a caftan, one of these religious coats, and he decides he approaches him, and the guy says he knows a bunch of Jewish guys who are in the business of smuggling people across, takes them to the house. Morris looks in. There's a bunch of religious Jews, Hasidim, and they're playing cards. And Morris decides, I don't really, these guys don't look too good. I don't think I like this picture. So he goes out again onto the street. And what does he do? He sees a Polish guy with a Bible under his arm. And he decides he's going to trust this Polish guy with a Bible under his arm. He doesn't know who he is. So all this kind of trusting in strangers to get from here to there. He has enough money to pay people, so he can pay the guy to take him across the border. And he does. So they bribe the guy, the German guard. And on the other side, you have a couple of local Polish peasants who help them get past the patrols and lead them through the forest. He gets to the Polish side, on which side he buys himself a train ticket. And again, he describes himself as well-dressed, well-presented, speaking good Russian, or in this case he's in Poland, but a respectable guy. And partly he wants to be treated well, he partly wants to anticipate anti-Semitism, being treated badly or in an undignified manner because he's perceived as Jewish. He ends up in Odessa, where his sister lives. He thinks he's going to lie low and maybe then go back, but someone reports him and he has to go turn himself in to the authorities, which he does. He goes to Bindera, he turns himself in, and eventually he's court-martialed and he gets 18 months in a military prison. He doesn't say where that is. I don't know, maybe Bindera Fortress had a prison in it, but someone would have to research out where it was he was kept. He describes the brutal conditions, discipline, corporal punishment. No smoking was a big deal for him. He's a guy who's very ready to break the rules when he needs to. In this case, he obeys all the rules, and he's released early for a good conduct. He's released from prison in summer of 1914, and as you can imagine, this is not such good time. Once again, he's on a train across Siberia back to Vladivostok to rejoin his regiment. When he gets back to Vladivostok, he finds he has a friendly commander. He's once again engaged as a secretary. He's competent in Russian again. He stays out of trouble, even though there is some unhappiness, obviously, in his regiment. You can see the sort of premonitions of the mutinies that are coming up during the war. There's an unloved sergeant major who is shot to death by the men in his unit. Morris is always a good guy. He's behaving well. However, it is the summer of 1914, and as he writes, I was almost finished with my service, and suddenly this disaster appears. He's still drawing up lists of supplies. That was his job, but now the supplies consist of new clothing, new underwear, new boots. Everything was changed in a hurry. And one of the things that's nice about this narrative is, this is what I wrote about in my book, The Big History of the War, the Revolution, the Civil War. And this is one single guy living through it. And over and over again, he's telling his own personal story. It could be actually, I was sorry I didn't use it in my book as a kind of illustration. He encapsulates over and over again situations which are absolutely typical and very vividly described. So this is a case in which, boom, war, and things are changing very, very quickly. Chaos ensues. Forced deportations from the war zone on the orders of the Army High Command. This is a kind of demographic disruption that Morris doesn't experience because he's in the army. Expulsions, people fleeing the war zone on their own flight, bjekstva, on their own initiative. The trains are overcrowded. A lot of the animus, a lot of the deportations were directed at the Jewish residents of the Pale of Settlement because they were in the border zone. They were suspected of being spies and traitors, and all this kind of suspicions is part of a general xenophobia connected with the war, but also builds on a kind of official anti-Semitism, visions of the Jews from before that pre-existed the war, pre-existed the emergency. At the same time, and here I have some interesting images. So these are examples of Jewish refugees expelled from the borderland regions. And there was a lot of publicity at the time of the plight of the refugees. About 3 million people overall were expelled into the interior of Russia by the Army High Command in the western provinces, not just Jews. And then the response to this attack on the Jews, an attack on their dignity and their patriotism and so on. So the Jewish press, and there was a Jewish press, tended to depict heroes, the heroic contribution of the Jews to the Russian war effort. So you have Isaac Gutmann, a hero, and this is the Jews in the war. This is the name of the publication at the time. Jakob Abramovich Gotz, who was a medic. They were offered a considerable number of Jewish medics, wounded Jews, and then an effort by the Russian language intelligentsia to counteract the anti-Semitic propaganda that accompanied the war. So this is this famous collection of essays by Russian, Polish, Ukrainian intellectuals refuting the charges of anti-Semitism and explaining why it was so dangerous and so objectionable. The Jews of Bender, as far as I could tell, were not subject to expulsion, but Bender itself experienced the war, the flood of refugees coming in, and wounded soldiers. And this was the impact of the war on the everyday life of the home front, not just the fighting in the war itself. So when war breaks out, this regiment in Vladivostok, where he is transported by train all the way back across the empire in the direction of Warsaw. And his unit was actually engaged in battle near Warsaw in October 1914. He wasn't involved because he's still employed as a clerk, so he's recording not just purchases and supplies, but the dead, the missing, and the captured. So that his occupation somewhat changes. However, despite his good luck so far and his maneuvering, he is always dependent on the goodwill of his boss. And at this moment, his friendly captain is wounded, is out of the picture, and he is subject to the caprices of the guy who replaces him. And this is a guy who doesn't like him, accuses him of being dishonest, and sends him out down into the ranks again. So he loses his position. Oh, thank you. You missed the best part of the talk. This is actually useful. Refreshment pause. Yes, okay. Where are we? Morris is going to war, finally. He's been in safety up till now. And from March 1916 to the outbreak of revolution in 1917, he's actually sees battle. He's on the battlefield. And his descriptions here are wonderful. And again, where do you get a description of a guy who's in the war? This is like Stendhal, this is like Tolstoy, Mr. Nobody in the war. So he describes his attempts to hide from gunfire. He finds a hole in the ground, he jumps into it. There was a gunshot that almost killed him, except it was caught in his backpack. He describes villages on fire. He describes peasants running away. And then in a most interesting episode, he describes him and a couple of his friends sneaking out into a deserted village and finding a wounded goose. And they build a fire, and they roast the goose, and they bring the food back to their comrades in the unit, and they have a nice dinner, because they typically didn't have enough to eat. He's probably no different than the average soldier in trying to avoid being killed, but he's not ashamed to admit it, at least when he's writing about it in old age. He doesn't say, oh, I was a hero like those Jewish heroes. You could say he was a coward. You could say he was just trying to save his own life. Heroism was not one of his values. He did not aspire to be a heroic soldier. He aspired to live through the war. And he is saved yet again by that same captain who comes back. He's recovered from his wounds, and he's stationed near Rouge. And he gets him transferred. He restores him to his role as secretary. And this is also very interesting. What is the secretary of an officer in the middle of World War I, which is a disaster, doing? So he's keeping records, but he's also going on errands. And the errands consist of, he travels to Odessa, Moscow, Petrograd, Kiev, in order to get things like smoked pork, sausages, goodies, treats that the captain wants. And Morris comments on it. He doesn't comment on it, he just records it. He doesn't say, oh, isn't this awful that the officers were enjoying these privileges during the war? It's just a laconic account. This is what I did. 1917, as everyone knows, was the year of revolution. Revolution is another form of dislocation. It transforms the lives of everybody. They don't have to go anywhere. And Morris describes the impact of the revolution. He says, everything continued as usual until revolution came.
Sorry, the one line, guys, says.
It's better? Okay, so here we have an ordinary Jewish guy describing the effect of the revolution. Until revolution came, everything was fine until revolution came, he says. This is totally unpolitical. Revolution is disorder. Revolution is a mess. Kerensky took over the regime for a short while, and the circumstances seemed to change. This was a sweet illusion. he says, all sorts of Soviets sprang up. The front was neglected. German soldiers and Russian soldiers fraternized in each other's trenches and drank schnapps. One time, Kerensky showed up, and he tried to convince the soldiers to continue guarding the front and attack the enemy, but it didn't work. Officers were ignored, discipline disappears, they're not saluted, and so on. This is something we historians read in the documents all the time, but here's a personal account. This happened to him, he observed it. He goes on one final errand, and that's it. He says, I'm going home, and he doesn't come back. So, what happens in the next slide? Yes. He decides to go home, but home is no longer a place of refuge. Displacement, turmoil become the norm, and stability is the exception. So the trains are filled with people backward and forward, discipline, the army is falling apart. This is a wonderful picture of peasants on the trains, filling the trains with their bags of good and food backward and forward. This is the Mishochniki. He encounters on his way home examples of deserters roaming the region, that is in Bessarabia by the time he gets there, pillaging, stealing horses, robbing Jews. And this is another interesting detail of his account that you find in the literature. He gets to Copanca, and he is greeted enthusiastically by both Jews and non-Jews, he says. He was a healthy young man. By now he's about 30. He said, I was dressed in the Tsar's uniform. I had a loaded revolver, and he looked upon me as their defender. He and a bunch of other guys get together and form a little militia to defend the village. Somehow or other, they hold guns and ammunition. This is a classic moment. And this is also an example, not of Jewish self-defense of Jews in particular, but of Jews integrated in a village in which the guys get together and protect themselves against the chaos around them. So in 1918, as those of you here know, things happened, particularly in Bessarabia. There's a Moldovan independent democratic republic is declared. There is a parliament is created and so on. He pays no attention to any of this. He doesn't mention the uprising against the Romanian occupation in May 1919, which is in Bindere. He just doesn't, these things don't affect him. He only reports what actually concerned him personally. He does describe, however, one historic event, the Battle of Bindere, at the end of January in 1918. Are these household words to those of you in the audience? Battle of Bindere? Guys? No. No. I thought, calls to Newcastle. Battle of Bindere. Okay. January 1918. No, but this is... Yeah, in Bindere, yeah. So, well, I thought here I am coming to... So he says... But this is interesting. So what is going on, right? I thought this was going to be redundant. You know, people would say, oh, yeah, the Battle of Bindere. Okay. But it's interesting. So what happens? He's in Copanca. They ring the bells. They sound the alarm. And somebody tells all the guys in town, the young men, to take their wagons and head for Bindere from this village. And they're supposed to halt the march of the Romanians who wanted to annex all of Bessarabia. This is his version of what's going on. The rare mention of political things. Somebody or other, he doesn't say who, threatens to shoot anyone who tries to get away. And this is my favorite sentence in the whole memoir is, you can imagine how I felt. In such a mess, you could easily get killed. So this is you know, an ordinary guy. So they're given arms when they get to Bindere, and they're told to defend against the enemy. And so he and a bunch of his friends in the unit say, decide, when the time comes to take up positions, we're going to just get out of here. Kuda glaza glijet. We're just going to run. And that's exactly what they did. They get shot at. They make it. Once again, he escapes. Once again, he is not being a hero. And he runs away. He goes to his aunt who lives nearby. He stumbles into her house, more dead than alive. The Romanians are shelling the city, and he describes the shells exploding. The explosions are heard for miles around. Everyone is hiding in the cellars. Windows are shadowed. Houses go up in flames. And the next morning, they get on they have a horse and cart. They go to a nearby village, which has a considerable Jewish community. Romanian troops now appear and try to grab them and grab them off the streets, shooting people without reason. So he takes off yet again, gun in hand, heading back to Copanca. Then they flee to the Russian side. He stays with his sister in Odessa, but then he goes back again to Tiraspol. So part of the reason I'm telling you all these facts is they're entertaining, they're illustrative of things we know on a bigger scale if we're historians, and what else am I telling you? A personal story. So he ends up in Tiraspol, and this is the family of my grandmother. My grandmother is second from the left, Riva, and her sisters, more or less about 1910. So you can see the kind of family it was. It was a traditional Jewish family. They weren't particularly, I should say, pious. They were kind of everyday observant. And the young women were dressed in modern contemporary clothes of the time. But Tiraspol is now on the side of the line, and this is 1918 we're talking about. So this is, it's not Ukraine yet. Ukraine is trying to be Ukraine. All sorts of forces are fighting against each other to capture Ukraine, and this is one of my favorite images of all time. I discovered it in the Slavonic Library in Prague when I was writing my big book, and now it's on the internet, of course. And this is the Ukrainian view of the Ukrainian Civil War in 1918. So in the middle are Ukrainian soldiers. On the top left is a Red Army soldier with the red star on his hat. On the right, in the brown, is the White Army, the pro-Tsarist, wanting to restore the empire. Up there, to the left of the Red Army, is a Polish soldier. Below him, Hungarian, and then two Romanian soldiers. So this is what's going on, and I have to make a footnote about this, this poster. This is a Ukrainian patriotic poster, and this is something Morris's experience. He says, bands of all kinds are roaming through the town. This is Tiraspol. Poles, Denikinci, Petlurovci. Soon the Bolsheviks arrive and demand tribute from the Jewish population, and so on. Before I get to the decision that he makes in these circumstances, I want to say a note about the origin of this poster. So this is a patriotic poster, and who made it? Now, this is in Russian for those of you who want to read some Russian. So it's the work of Yuri Yesenko. Now, who is Russian? Who is Ukrainian? Where do they start? Where do they end up? He's a guy who was born in Kislovodsk, dies in Paris. The artist, he was associated, Gasyenko was associated with Pityura and in various other roles. He was at Brest-Litovsk with the Ukrainian delegation, so he was involved in Ukrainian international, mobilization for national recognition and so on. Marcel Vertet is actually born in Budapest. He's Jewish, he dies in Paris. All these guys in motion from one place to another. You can find people who are born and die in the same place, but you find a lot of people who are not. So this is Ukrainian nationalism. Now, Ukrainians can embrace, like Bessarabia, the fact that they are populated by many different peoples with many different cultures and languages and so on that constitute or contribute to the feeling of the place, the identity of the place. And I have to show this because it's paradoxical in its way, but it's also typical in its way, illustrative. So. wait a second, Book of Year, where is Besarabshina? Kuban? Oh, yeah. Right. Besarabshina. Yeah, Besarabshina. Excuse me? Okay. Yeah, okay. So this is in a sense, this you could be a whole lecture on this one poster, I think. It's a fabulous poster, fabulous. But with many ironies built into it, many interesting details. But tying it back to this guy who has no perspective. Moishe Greenfield is not thinking about world history or Ukrainian nationalism or the Ukrainian state or even the Bessarabian or the Moldovan, autonomous republic. He's just trying to get through all of this mess. But he reports on the bands changing hands. If I have it, I have to watch my time, but so everything becomes expensive. He starts to fill another, this time not anti-Semitic stereotype, but Bolshevik stereotype. He's a speculator. He trades in currencies. He finds all sorts of things to trade in. He gets in trouble over and over again. He gets arrested by the Cheka. He has these wonderful descriptions of being interrogated in Odessa. He is grabbed by what he calls two sturdy Bolsheviks armed to the teeth. And then he's taken into an interrogation room. A buyer and a seller sit up front. Opposite them is a commissar, blind in one eye with disheveled hair. At the end of the table is a revolver. The other end is a bomb. The table is covered with all kinds of money, a gold watch and chain. They grill him about his business deals, and he was sure that this was the end of his days, but all of a sudden the commissar says, "Get lost. We don't need you. Go home." He goes home. It's a miracle. But this happens over and over. He ends up in jail. Riva, his wife, is constantly running around trying to bribe people, trying to get people to get him out. He gets out, he goes out, he trades in something else again. So he is one of these characters the Bolsheviks are out to repress, definitely. But at a certain point, things get really bad. As he describes it, the White Guards and the Pegurovtsi tried to chase the Bolsheviks away. There was a regular war in our town. So if you want to have history from below about what is happening in a little town in Bessarabia during the Civil War, you can get it from Moishe Greenfield. So he is then drafted by the Bolsheviks. Once again, he deserts. The same thing again. He runs away. He is helped by Jews he encounters along the way. I have to speed up here a little bit. In Tiraspol again, he is ordered to appear for labor duty. Strings are pulled. He is exempted. There are all sorts of tricks to get people out of the draft. He decides it's time to leave. So once more, he crosses the Dniester River, which is by now the Ukrainian border. It's 1921. Morris is therefore, as I said, able to leave what is soon to be Soviet Russia by returning home. This is this displacement in place. He's going to a place he knows, which is now a new place. He's smuggled over the river by a peasant and a Romanian soldier. He pays them a certain amount of money. And then, and this is the dramatic moment in my mother's life, my mother is now 1 year old. So first goes grandpa across the river. The next day goes grandma with baby Firima in her hands over the frozen river. It's a dramatic moment of climbing up this and that, and so on. They get to the other side, and they are now settled in Romania. And Morris comments that they're first quarantined, but he is immediately accepted. He said, "I was accepted and easily got his papers because I was Bessarabian born and knew the Romanian language well." At this point, he's tired of Copanca, too small town, and they settle in Gândar. And here's another slide to give you a sense of the period. He's not alone, they have other relatives. So grandpa standing up, in front of him sitting is my grandma, Riva, and in her lap is my mother, Firima. He now gets in trouble with the Romanian police. He was in trouble with the Bolsheviks on the other side. He ends up in prison again. He has to be gotten out of prison again by pulling strings. But these are my interesting documents, and this I don't have to translate. This is my grandfather's certificate of nationality. This is from 1927. Over there is my mother's school report. She went to school from the age of, I guess, whenever you start going to school, to the age of 10, when they finally made it out. But this was not easy to immigrate at this point. In 1923, there was the opportunity to leave, and this is a document that was submitted to the American consulate, but they decided that Riva's sisters should go first. They had all the documents, and they would come later. Unfortunately, in 1924, the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act in the United States restricted quotas severely, so it was very hard. So 1923 was the one moment when Morris made a decision that did not help him out, but he made it on behalf of the family. So 1923 goes by, and they spend then the next anxious years in Romania, until finally in 1930, they get on a ship and go to New York. And this is an interesting story too. How did they get out of there? This is something you've been working on. They get their papers, they have everything, but they need to get their ticket. And they're supposed to get their ticket from the HIAS, and this is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. This was an organization founded in 1881 after the wave of pogroms, I presume, in the United States. So they have an office in Bucharest. So they show up in this office, and the clerk says to them, "It's not your turn." And what's the problem? Morris says, he explains the problem. The office manager was in love with the red-headed bookkeeper. And in order to make money to keep this bookkeeper in style, he would sell next. So you show up and say, "It's my turn." He would say, "No, you're not next. You had a this is a way of being." And this is what's lovely about this document also. He has this sort of comic irony about the accidental events in his own life. Eventually, he gives up on the bookkeeper, he gives up on the clerk in Iasi, in Bucharest, and he goes straight to the office of the French line, and he has a friendly clerk there who gets him a ticket on the SS Lafayette, and they make it to New York. Back and forth, Chicago, New York, until they finally settle down. They become American citizens. This is somewhat later. This is my grandmother. And the paradox is that this guy in motion, who had a lot of chutzpah, as we say in Yiddish, who managed to wheel his way through the obstacles and dangers of his young life, ends up in Brooklyn, in a country that is famous for mobility, the restless United States. And in the restless United States, Riva and Morris settle down. They settle down in a small Yiddish-speaking community, and his years of communicating across cultures, of being someone who can translate, are over. He is settled in his own small milieu. He never really learned English, which was a source of embarrassment to him, but he still had the aspiration to education and culture, which he passed along to the next generation. The generation after that is where I come into the story. So I'm the first generation of my family to be born in the United States. In any case, this is the story of Moshe Greenfield. Many things can be made out of it by a historian, and I'm glad to bring his story back to the place where he started out and present it to you today. Thank you for listening. And if you want to present or ask questions in Russian, if that's more comfortable, that's fine. I will answer in English.
Laura, thank you very much for this simply fascinating story. I could use some words like micro history or ego history or biography, but I think it's more than that because it weaves together through your grandfather's life story, indeed, a lot of processes of events that we only know, let's say, from the macro scale. Or so. Well, but before proceeding to the Q&A, I think I should give the floor to Igor, who will comment on Professor Engelstein's presentation and maybe contextualize some of some things we have just heard for the local audience. So Igor, please.
Thank you very much, Andrei. Thank you very much, Laura. And thanks for accepting our invitation, as well as Michael. Michael, actually, it's a promo bit in the beginning. We have Michael Geyer tomorrow talking about empires also. So hopefully you agree with me that we made a good choice to start with Laura from a professor with Bessarabian roots, kind of ego histoire, quelque chose comme ça, and then move to a broader topic of empires. So I'm very pleased to have you here, and finally to have you here. And let me try to, as Andrei suggested, let me try to contextualize Maurice Greenfield's story in the broader perspective of the late Tsarist Empire and then post-war, First World War decade in which Maurice was living this turning point. This is the turning point of the of the 20th century. First World War is changing dramatically everything, from the way the war is fought. Yes, it's the first total war. It's not complete as the Second World War, but this is we have the main, let's say, indicators that's kind of anticipating the classical, would say, total war, which is the Second World War. So we have with the First World War, we have the birth of mass politics as well. We have the birth of age of ideologies, like other authors would say, Hobsbawm and others, yes, and of course other scholars, German ones, that emigrated. Not only Maurice emigrated as a, let's say, rank and file citizen, but a lot of European Jews immigrated in the interwar in America. So what this story tells us about the whole picture of the period on the eve of the First World War, during the First World War, and afterwards. This is telling us the story of Jewish people, first of all, their fate under the Tsarist period, how they were perceived, and this is actually an invitation for others to know about more the period from your book, actually, which talks about politics in the late Tsarist period, starting with late or early 80s, actually, the first pogroms in the Russian Empire, following the assassination of Alexander II on March 1st, 1880, 81, sorry, of course, 81, which is a turning point for the fate, I would say, of the the Jewish community in the Russian Empire, because the Tsar was very respected by the peasants because of the reforms he implemented in the 1960s after the Crimean War, especially the abolition of servitude, of how you say in English? Serfdom. Yeah, thank you. Of serfdom, and why it had impact on the Jewish community, because in popular opinion, there was a understanding or a perception that the Jews did that, but we know that only one, let's say, participants in the killing was Jewish, and I think others even are doubting that he's actually a German name, but it's actually German more than Jewish. Anyway, this had a profound impact, because we have in the next years we have mass pogroms in the Russian Empire up to 1884, and this is the new, let's say, page in the pogroms in Russian Empire, because it's the first time when the pogroms are touching not only the cities and towns but also the villages. So anti-Semitism is becoming let's say, violent. It was there because of religious, economical, but now it becomes really violent. What about Morris? Closer to your story. It's interesting, and it is interesting that the Jews, contrary to the perception among a lot of East European, I would say, the Jews participated actively in the First World War, in the Russian army, as you said. There are a lot of cases of desertion and so on, but nobody can claim monopolize this. This happened among different ethnic groups. It was normal because desertion actually was a strategy of survival. And I was very impressed to see recently in Vienna a monument to deserters, kind of trying to normalize the idea that desertion is not, traitors to the fatherland and so on and so on. This is a strategy of survival. And this is very important because, talking about the Second World War, maybe some of you remember Solzhenitsyn's treatment of Jewish participation in the Second World War in the Red Army, making in his Destilé Vmeste, 200 years together, about the Russian Soviet Jews. He's anti-Semitic in what he is saying, because he says, yes, there were a lot of Jews in the Red Army, but they were not fighting on the front line. They were not they were not risking their lives. They were kind of in the home front, something like that. And I liked Benedict Sarnov's reply on this idea, saying this is really anti-Semitic, because the place the Jews had in the Second World War in the Red Army actually is reflecting their high level of education, basically urban. They were educated, and the state needed them there. Be sure the state needed them badly as medics, as correspondents, as fighting for another part of the front, not for the. So we should take in account that. And in Romania also, the Jews were actively participating in the war in the Romanian army, and even Antonescu later, during the Second World War, would exempt them and recognize their merit and not deport them, or which is not saying Antonescu is of course, but it's important to say the Jews were participating in other armies during the First World War. Now, about the what we call something inappropriately probably the Russian Civil War. Russia was not anymore. So it's, but for convenience, we should say Soviet Russia. It's hard to find an alternative. But anyway, we know about that. And it's interesting to see, of course, this map that you showed on historical Ukrainian lands. Of course, it's a part of propaganda from the period. There are different other maps from the Romanian side and so on and so on. But what I wanted to say, which is less known in the West, but it's published by an American historian, Glenn Torrey, on Romania in the First World War. There is a chapter there on the Bessarabian issue, so it's kind of complementing the map and the Ukrainian perspective, which is interesting. He used English, French, German, American sources, diplomatic sources from the period. And what is kind of paradoxical is that even though the First World War is a fight for life and death, yes, between different alliances and countries, on the Bessarabian issues, there is a it's kind of consensus between Germany, France, and England that it should belong to Romania. It's immediately after the Brest-Litovsk March, early March 1918. But this is interesting, yeah, for different reasons. For different reasons. Every part of the conflict, the three ones I mentioned, they were saying Bessarabia. Also from ethnodemographic reasons. So this is also should take in account. What you said about Bender battle in January. This was not 18. It was not a unique battle. So meaning clashes between the incoming Romanian army and the local groups. The resistance was mainly organized by the Bolsheviks. There were other clashes in Leova, just in the south on the Prut there. There were other clashes in Călăraș and other parts. But the main one, yes, it's in Bender, in Tighina, in late January 1918. And actually, Bender or Tighina is the main, let's say, contested area, and which brings us to nowadays. You see, we say Transnistria, the area beyond Dniester on the eastern part, but still now Bender is a part of the breakaway Transnistrian Moldavian Republic. So the Bolsheviks in 1918-19, they wanted to have at least this bridgehead to Bessarabia. They understood it's difficult or almost impossible to recapture Bessarabia, but they wanted to do that. And in May 1919, the famous so-called Bender rebellion in the Soviet historiography is important. They sent the Red Army of about 500 soldiers. So it's very interesting. And in that battle participated the future Prime Minister, you would say, and the first secretary of Communist Party, of the regional Communist Party of Autonomous Republic, one of the founding fathers of Moldovan Autonomous Republic, which is Grigore Stare. Yeah, so Andrei is saying I should be brief. So the story of Maurice is very interesting. He is not alone. He's not alone in this experience, living through and surviving through the First World War, the Russian Civil War. I think I have sent you the story of Piotr Tsetva, who's also from Bender. Petr Tsetva. I put this case in my book on class enemy. He is born in Bender, and he's also crossing the border in 1919, 1920 to Tiraspol and then back to Nice. And he has problems both with Čeka in Tiraspol and with Romanian Siguranța in Bender. And he goes across Dniester River to find his 3 or 4 brothers that he didn't know, the family didn't have any news from the beginning of the war. So it's kind of very familiar family issues, and he comes back and forth, and finally he is caught in Tiraspol in 1920 and killed by the Čeka, and he's the first known victim of the Red Terror, first Bessarabian victim of Red Terror in this period. So it's not unique, Maurice. There are a lot of, in the 20s from Romania, Gagauzis went to Argentina and Brazil. Some of them came back, as you said, returning with the story of Maurice before the First World War. So it's a lot of going there and there. And it's interesting that he goes and I asked you earlier, did he decided to go to America because of the Great Depression starting in 1929? You said no. And actually, I agree with that, because the Great Depression started in Romania in 1930, a bit later, and it's finished a bit later as well in 1934, more like in France, so there is a... So thank you very much, and we are looking for questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
Sorry. So the question was, is there any variation in his language in the course of the memoir? I haven't read the original Yiddish. This is echoing. Is that okay? Okay. All I have is my mother's English version of his Yiddish. Maybe with some effort I will learn enough Yiddish to read it myself, but it won't be better than her Yiddish. I'm assuming it's the same Yiddish throughout. What's interesting, when I was a child, he showed me his Russian handwriting. He was very proud of it. It was also his survival instrument. This is what got him through the war, his good handwriting in Russian, and his ability to speak Russian, obviously, because he was recognized by officers looking for clerks, and that's the job he fulfilled, as you mentioned. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. In any case, but it's a good question. And one interesting thing is he showed off to me as a child his beautiful Russian handwriting. Unfortunately, he didn't speak Russian with me, so I had to start all over again by myself. However, it's interesting he doesn't write it in Russian. Yiddish is still, but also at the end of his life, the skills he used to have, which were Romanian and Russian speaking, and even riding a horse and shooting a gun, these are not useful in Brooklyn. And at the end of his life, he speaks Yiddish all the time, and my own feeling is, so what kind of a Jew was he? He wanted to be a modern Jew. He didn't have a beard. He was observant, but if someone said, have some sausage, kolbasa, he ate the sausage. If he was in the army, he did what he needed to do. He wanted to be part of the world and be Jewish. So it was a kind of modern Jewishness, but he wasn't an educated person. He wasn't in the intelligentsia. He would have wanted to be, but he couldn't be. So at the end of his life, I think his Jewishness became more prominent in his self-identity, because all the other parts of him, the things he did as a young man, were no longer part of his life. When I encountered him, as a child, he's Yiddish speaking, he went to shul, but they were not, excessively religious. It was just taken for granted. This is who he is. But there's a very good question, and I don't know, I can't judge the language itself.
Alex Gottel was the University of Florida. Thank you for a wonderful talk. Last summer, working at the Moldovan archives, I found the name of my relative in the file related to the government commission I studied.
Oh.
And I was shocked a bit, but
Wait, so
fortunately,
take it a little further.
okay. It wasn't my close relative, but anyway, it's like a conflict of interest. So as a professional historian working with these family narratives, are you facing with conflicts between historical data and your family narratives, and how you solve this problem?
Well, I haven't really started to, well, I did publish something about him. I used him as the introduction to the other work that I had on the, I gave a series of lectures on anti-Semitism, and I compared a Russian case, a Ukrainian case, and a Polish case. And in the introduction, I used my grandfather's story to show a paradox, that often in his story, where you expect anti-Semitism, it doesn't show up. He registers it, he's very aware of it, but he's not looking for it all the time. He's not under a cloud all the time. There's going to be a pogrom or there's going to be an insult. And I find this very interesting. But if I work on this, I've read other people's memoirs of their family, people who had educated, people who knew famous people and had private correspondence, and then you ask yourself, do you invade their privacy and so on. This is my grandfather, my Zedi, and I don't think I think I could very well use this material without feeling I'm transgressing some private barrier that I shouldn't go beyond. It's not really personal, it's not intimate, He meets my grandma was his childhood sweetheart, they get married, and then it's the two of them, they have kids. There's a way in which it's, I don't know, I would have to start working on it, but I don't see a conflict of interest. In some ways, he's so typical. He's a personal incarnation of the things I learned about as a historian, of these anecdotes. And there's more, I had too much that I could fit in. I was already overburdened with examples. His description of his interactions with the Bolsheviks and the Cheka are hilarious. He has a sense of humor. He goes on about how he keeps bumping into them and sneaking out of them. And he says, at first it was easy to forge the papers. He said, but then the real commissars showed up from Moscow. Oh dear. I mean, they got efficient. That was a bad idea. And so on. So it can be used in a way to illustrate a lot of things. I'm not sure what it can be used as the beginning or the center of some historical project. I'm thinking about it.
Thank you.
Well, you mentioned that he crossed the border and received the Romanian citizenship, but still he was Jewish, same with his family. And my question is, did they encounter any anti-Semitic sentiments from the Romanian authorities or maybe the society?
That's a very good question. And what's very interesting to me is this memoir has a lot of detail about what happened to him, starting from childhood until the moment when they cross into Romania. And then he focuses on his attempts to earn money and get by. They have a grocery store. They sell a piece of jewelry and they establish a grocery store in Romania. But it's a very good question because it points to an absence. He does not describe what happened to them in Romania. My mother told me, verbally, that it was very unpleasant, unhappy, associated with prejudice against Jews. But he chooses not to mention this. Now, if you interpret a document, it doesn't matter if it's my grandfather or somebody else, right? What are the reasons for something being there or not being there? Because we know as historians there were problems with anti-Semitism in Romania in this period. He doesn't dwell on that. He doesn't say it. He really talks about those years are kind of very short. And then he goes to the problems of setting himself up in America. He couldn't find a job in Chicago, and then he went back and so on. But that is an empty spot. Now maybe this was his temperament, that he didn't want to dwell on the really difficult times. But he mentions anti-Semitism in his story of Imperial Russia, for sure, especially in the army, but not in everyday life so much. I think he had the feeling of Bessarabia as a place that was comfortable for him as a Jewish person. And that your question is a good question, and it points to an absence. So if I were using this as a historian, I would have to go out and do research and say, what would have been the situation of somebody living in Bindir from 1921 to 1930? He obviously still wanted to go to America, but not necessarily because of what happened to him in Romania, because he had this aspiration. He went to America already. He knew what it was like. And he said when he comes back, he didn't intend to come back the first time and stay. The experience in Romania must have confirmed something that he already knew he wanted. So that's a very good question. I think you have the making of a historian, if you aren't one already.
In the latter part of his life in America, who was his community? What kind of people did he seek out? What synagogue did he go to? Were they also Eastern European Pale of Settlement Jews who immigrated? Who was his people in the end?
That's a very good question, too. Okay. So what do I know about that? I know that he lived in a part of Brooklyn that had a lot of immigrant Jews. I know that they spent 100% of their time speaking Yiddish. He was able to communicate in English, but it was rudimentary. My grandmother had less education even in Yiddish, so she would read the Yiddish paper with moving her lips, so to speak. They had a grocery store, as you see. He went to a shul. I remember this shul myself, because I would occasionally be sent in to get him out. This is a shul in which the men are in the ground floor and the women are upstairs, so my mother would say, go get your grandma. They followed the Jewish customs, and I don't think they reached out into the general sort of wider public world. There was a big cultural, this is typical of immigration too. So my mother came to America when she was 10 without any English. In about 6 months, she was speaking English, she was in school, and the cultural gap and the linguistic gap between my parents and their parents was enormous. So all the conversation between my parents and the grandparents was in Yiddish, which I understood as a child because I was babysitting with my grandmother, hearing Yiddish and so on. But I didn't have a formal education. And so I was raised in a Jewish family, but non-religious, distinctly non-religious. I don't have a Jewish religious background. So they kind of ended their lives in this very small world. So in an interesting way, you see the trajectory of my grandfather. He starts in a very small world. His horizon is enormously expanded as a result of these historical events. They hit him right on the head. Eventually, he ends up in another small world. And this second small world is less variegated, less differentiated than the original one, because although New York City is a very mixed place, he didn't live in all of New York City. He lived in this little corner of Brooklyn. So I would answer your question and say, so all the aspiration of the wider world was transferred to the next generation. So my parents were professionals. They had advanced degrees. They were, they had no foreign accent because they came as children. And yet they had the whole cultural background of Eastern Europe, of where they came from. My father was born in Poland. So Polish Yiddish Jews on one side, and Bessarabian Jews on the other side, speaking variations of Yiddish, and that's my background. So,
I can relate. I am also the first generation who doesn't speak Yiddish.
I can relate. I'm thinking now how interesting it is that our families had more or less the same start in the same Bessarabia with the same Jewish background, and then your family moved with in your grandfather's person, and my family stayed here. But still, we have the same features, and we ended up more or less at the same steps with just with a shift of generations, I would say, yeah? As same as you're speaking about your family, my family, I was grown up in the Yiddish-speaking family between my parents and my grandparents, not so usually speaking Yiddish with me and to me.
Right.
That's why I can understand it, but not so fluently speaking. My parents were the first educated generation doctors, professors, and for me it's a little bit easier with this background, with my parents highly educated, but with this pre-great background that I do remember, my less educated grandparents who spoke at the same time Yiddish, Russian, Romanian, some French. Suddenly, just from their childhood, that's so fascinating that we have much more in common than the background from early 20th century. We went in some parallel directions in those very different contexts.
I want to make a footnote on this. I have a friend and a colleague whose background started in the same, not in Bessarabia, but in Nepal somewhere. But the reason that our families have this trajectory is that our grandparents were not educated enough. Now, if they had been more educated, they would have entered the Russian intelligentsia. And in her case, they would have stayed. They would have become Soviet, and they would have had that other, what's missing for my family is there was one cousin who did stay, who did have a Soviet part of his life. He stayed in Moldova, served in the Red Army, or was evacuated, I'm not sure, and left Moldova. But when I met him in the 90s, he was very Soviet. He had lived through the Soviet period. That's what's missing. Well, you had also in Bessarabia, in Moldova, a Soviet period. But when I think of my grandparents, if they had, he wanted, let's say there was no war, let's say there was no revolution. He aspired to have more education, to move into the educated classes. And that was not possible. And that, in a sense, is what drove him out. The inability to succeed. And then, of course, historical disaster intervened, and they had to get out. And what's lucky is they got out in time. So one aunt, sister of my grandfather in Romania, was murdered by her Romanian neighbors in 1941. And then other of these numerous siblings, typhus or this or that, or immigrant. So these are the options: disease, murder, or immigration. For that socio-economic, that demographic population. Yeah.
At the same time, it's not, as far as I can consider, it's not a story of diverging and then converging. I'm pretty sure that my parents would have a common language with your parents, for example. So being some sort of Soviets, but still very Jewish, very anti-Semitic a little bit, dissident a little bit, let's call it that way. My parents.
Your parents were anti-Semitic?
Anti-Soviet.
Oh, anti-Soviet.
Anti-Soviet dissidents.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
it's these stories are parallel.
Yes.
So our Yiddishkeit makes it parallel, I think, I guess, or I don't know what.
Yeah, it's a classic trajectory from into professional categories. And even though my grandfather's aspiration was commercial, he didn't have, but on the other hand, he did have he was artistic, he had a good handwriting, he wanted to write his story. What's distinctive about my grandfather, frankly, is this document. Many people's grandfathers went through something. First of all, it was a good story. He was adventurous. He tells it well, and he wrote it down. And that's what's interesting also about it. There is a document.
One last question. more.
I like questions.
Hello. One of the empty time periods for me is, or not the time periods, but what I want to know. Migrants who move across the oceans usually do not cut off ties entirely. Okay. So yes, I understand his embeddedness in the Brooklyn communities and all that, but I want to hear what continued after 1930 immigration and Moisei and Rivas and their children and grandchildren connection either to the Soviet Union or to Romania, right? Did they correspond with their relatives back home? Did they send money or photographs? Did they visit? Did they aspire to visit? I know that the war, intervened. That was a big, moment. But I also know you kind of became one of the connections, right, between Moisei and the Soviet Union, right? Not necessarily to Bessarabia, right? So can we talk a little bit about those, the ties that were not entirely cut off?
First on this question, my grandparents never went back to visit. Somehow, miraculously, in a way I did not understand, somebody back there in Moldova had the addresses of my parents. Now, how that happened, I actually don't know, and I can never find out. My parents went back as tourists, and they went down, met people, they went to Odessa, but the main tie was emotional. That my mother had this incredible sense of loss. My mother was a very avid gardener. The aunt had a farm. All this countryside, this Bessarabian countryside, was very strong feelings for her. The association with Yiddish was emotionally completely saturated. Eventually, the only assistance that ever happened was when these remaining relatives wanted to leave Moldova in the 1990s. Then my parents helped them and sent them money. And they went to Israel, however, not to the United States. So in my case, the Soviet Union was a problem. But there was a nostalgia where there wasn't any desire to go back. We're safe now. No.
I guess my question is related to that, and it's how did your grandparents and your parents perceive the Soviet Union and Romania while they were in the US? How did they read the news there? What did they think about the regimes there? And also, I'm sorry, I was a bit late, and maybe you mentioned this at the beginning of your talk, but I was also wondering whether your grandparents were speaking a lot about these experiences, or you just read them, yeah? Thank you.
No, they didn't speak about them. They didn't tell stories and so on. What they did was they sort of embodied it. So my grandmother, the baking, the cooking, the pastries, and so on. And to a certain extent, while they were still alive, the rituals, right? But I didn't get a Jewish education, so that was another barrier between me and them. But you asked another question. That was a good question. Oh, yes. So politically, interestingly, my parents were more like Nadezhda, Greenfield. My parents were kind of Menshevik-style socialists in the United States. So my parents were very much, had they been in Russia, they would have been in the socialist intelligentsia. So their critique of the Soviet Union was it was not the socialism that they wanted. They were very critical of the Soviet Union, but they were also critical of capitalism. So they were and they also, I have to make it very clear, they live in New York. New York is a cultural ecosystem in which everyone is an immigrant. So being an immigrant is not a distinctive feature. Many people like themselves, a sort of Jewish, intellectual, politically aware, and they had a community, an intellectual community in the social world. They went to the public universities of New York in the 1930s. This is a whole famous story, right? So that was this was their cultural orientation, but it's a very good question. They were political, they were interested in politics, and this differentiated them from my grandparents. My grandfather his Bolsheviks are characters in an adventure story. They're fighting against other characters. So these different bands, this is his threatening his existence, and he's a smart guy and trying to get through all this stuff. He's not interested in politics. My parents were interested in politics, and I'm the one who went back intellectually. So I went back and I learned Russian, I learned Polish, and I reconnected to something. And I think my grandfather would have been very happy about that. And I'm not sure how aware he was of, when he died, how far I had gotten, probably not very far down that road. But in the world of imagined people, this is a connection. So I think of them up there thinking, she's back in Bessarabia. How interesting.
Okay, thanks to everyone, and first of all to Professor Engelstein for the just excellent presentation and the Q&A. I'm sorry to be strict, we are out of time, simply. Well, let's have a round of applause for our speaker.
Yeah, and we are inviting you tomorrow, the same time, the same place here, for another presentation by Michael Geyer. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.